Hey everybody. Okay, this has gone live. There's like a new format or something. So I'm trying to make sure I get this right. Okay. Um, this is going to be another video on sort of ontological or epistemological. I can never say that word. Epistemological issues. So if you get bored with those, feel free to skip it. This isn't going to be like how to get an ISFJ to fall in love with you or anything like that. So let's see here, where to start. Okay, I want to get into topics that I've talked about before, but I was sort of I've been cruising a lot on the MBTI YouTube pages, and I just thought I'd sort of revisit some of these sort of methodologies out there or approaches in typology, and vent a little, but also hopefully sort of share something. And a lot of it stems from, I back when I was in grad school, I taught sort of scientific research classes, like how to design studies and stuff. And a large part of it was just sort of like, how do we know what we know, right? The epistemological philosophical issues, right? Like how do we get comfortable knowing what we know and can rely on, whatever our theory is or whatever we think we know is. And so I sort of get a bee in my bonnet, so to speak. Um, when it comes to things like typology and whatnot. And so I'm going to riff on that and, take from it what you will. So, um, the the first thing I'm going to start off with is just sort of a general word of advice um, that applies in all situations, even outside of typology. And if you ever find yourself arguing with anybody and about whether or not something is true or not true, really the only thing you can really do, or what you eventually need to do, is ask the person, what can I tell you or what can I show you that would convince you that you are wrong? Okay. So if you have some sort of disagreement with somebody about whether something is true or not true, or is the case or not the case, the only way you're going to make any sort of progress is if the two of you can agree that there's some sort of evidence out there that if you're able to show it, that the person will accept that they are wrong, right? Otherwise, if they can't tell you, right, like, what it would take them to convince them that they're wrong, then there's really no point in arguing, right? I mean, there's no point because you're not going to be able to convince them, right? It's just sort of a matter of, at that point, it's just a war of attrition, right? It's just, who can outlast the other one. But if it really is a true argument about whether or not something is true or is not the case, then they should be able to give you something to where if you can show it, they would be convinced that they're wrong. Okay. And then the burden is on you to actually show it, right? And that's fundamentally, the way science works, right? It's the way the scientific method works, and it's the way that, you know, we as at least a Western culture have certain gotten comfortable with the question of, how do we know what we know? And even there, and all you scientists out there who are wagging your finger at me, even there, we still aren't 100% sure at any given point, right, that something is or is not the case. The only thing we can really do is just prove or demonstrate that some sort of claim or some sort of theory or some sort of proposition is not true, right? So we can never really, and this is a deep, deep philosophical question that lots of philosophers have been struggling with since the dawn of time, of whether or not we can ever really know that something is true or not, um, outside of kicking a rock or something, right? Um, and so, sorry, this is spilling myself. Okay. Anyways, um, so, okay, so let's bring it back to typology. And I think, a big trap that, a lot of the experts out there on YouTube fall into is this problem of, they sort of just create a war of attrition, right? Like, I've got this idea that so and so is certain, such and such type. And here's why, they like ideas, they like, sensory information, or they like to drive fast cars, or they don't like to drive fast cars, or they like math, or they don't like math. And they just sort of pile on evidence to sort of support their claim, but they never really provide any sort of framework where they would say, hey, if you can show me X, Y, and Z, then I will accept that, whatever I'm claiming is not true, right? So if I'm going to take the position that George Washington is an ISTJ or something like that, right? There's a couple of approaches, and the first approach is basically what everybody does out there, is they just sort of say, well, ISTJs do this. ISTJs are reserved but reliable and industrious and hardworking, and George Washington is all those things, and therefore he must be an ISTJ. And then they make it a little deeper and say, an ISTJ is going to have extroverted thinking. And here's all these examples of him using extroverted thinking, and yeah, that could be very convincing. And, I'm not in any position to tell you that you're wrong, but I'm also not in any position to tell you that you're absolutely right. All I know is you just sort of piled on some evidence to support your claim, but you could be ignoring like 90% of his life where he's out partying all the time, or, doing like crazy non-ISTJ things, right? And so to really have sort of a valid framework, you have to approach it in, from that angle, but you also have to have some sort of framework where where you sort of put it out there where, like, if he's not an ISTJ, then here are the things that he would not do, or here are the things that he would have issues doing or problems doing, right? And if you can show me that he was perfectly capable of doing those things and did them all of the time, then I would be convinced he's not an ISTJ, right? So does that make sense? In other words, is there some way to convince you that, and you're willing to admit it, right, that he is not an ISTJ, or whatever type, whatever person you're picking, right? And that's where I think a lot of people sort of, don't really tie up the bow too well. So the next thing I want to also mention is, I read recently this book called The Three Body Problem, and I'm not gonna give any spoilers, so don't feel like you need to skip ahead or anything. It's a great book if you haven't read it and you're into sci-fi and, first contact type novels. It's really cool. I've only read the first one, so don't give me any spoilers on the other ones. Okay. But the three body problem is actually an old physics problem that is sort of illustrative, or, illustrates some of the problems with typology, MBTI, all of that. And the physics problem, the three body problem, sort of goes like the following. So when you have two bodies, like a sun and the earth, okay, and the sun is, sort of the bigger object and forcing the earth into its gravitational pull, then you have very, very reliable calculations about the way that the earth is going to revolve around the sun. It's going to take 365 0.25 days, to make it around the sun. It's been doing that for thousands of years. It's pretty much, the oldest body of knowledge that we have, or just the way that the planets revolve around the sun. And we have very, very good calculations of how long it takes and all that, right? And we have for thousands of years and, across cultures. And so with the two body problem, where you have the sun and the earth, or the sun and the Venus, and so you only have one body causing the gravitational pull on another body, it's very easy to make predictions. Okay. Problem is if you were to add a third body, so like a second sun, right, where they all have gravitational effects on each other, then it becomes impossible to predict the ways that the objects are going to move, because they're all sort of pulling on each other, and one might be pulling on the other a little, but then the third one comes in and it creates a whole other sort of gravitational pull, and then one might spin out of that and another one comes in. And so you can see how it gets very, very complicated very, very quickly, right? And so the problem is that there's no like reference point in the way that you just the sun and the earth have, right? When you just have the two body issue. When you have the three body issue, they're all sort of serving as reference points at one point or another, where, two of them might be revolving around one, but then the other one starts revolving around the other one, and it disrupts the gravitational pull on the other one. And, and so you just have this, almost chaotic system, right? Now that there might be some physicists out there that have sort of figured out this, I don't know. But that's sort of the historical problem. And if there's any physicists out there that, can correct me on that, please do. So what does this have to do with personality type? So it's another one of it's a way of describing like how complicated this stuff can get, right? And the problem is that with each of the personality types, with like all 16 of them, I don't think there's a single individual, either living or historically, that everybody agrees is a ENTJ, or everybody agrees is an ISTJ, or everybody agrees is an INFJ. Now, there's some that sort of are, we kind of think of, the quintessential ENTJ, like Napoleon or Julius Caesar, but we don't even know what Napoleon and Julius Caesar really were. Like, most of what we know about them, they kind of made up. There was a lot of propaganda. Napoleon, and you'll see this in the movie, I'm sure, coming up, that he sort of made up a lot of his stories just, so everybody would be on his side. So even there, we don't really know, was he an ENTJ or not? I mean, we got plenty of evidence that maybe he was, but we don't know for sure. But even somebody who's living today, like let's just pick Barack Obama. There's a million of, well, there's not a million because there's only 16 types, but there's a lot of different takes on what, is he an ESFJ? Is he an ENTP? Is he an ISFJ? All, and people sort of focus on different things and they come up with their own sort of theory of what he is. And that's fine. I mean, that's all the fun of this, right? But the problem is, but if you really want sort of like an ontological solution, or, a epistemological solution, like we know what we know, you've got to have some sort of reference point, right? There's got to be some sort of person out there that everybody agrees is an INFP, right? And we just don't have that, right? We have people that come very close, where like 90% of the people sort of agree that this guy's a INFP or this lady's an ENTJ, but there's always going to be that sort of dissent, and you never really know for sure, right? So it's sort of like our little version of the three body problem, right? Because, just when you get comfortable that George Washington is your ISTJ and he's your gold standard, and, if you run across anybody that sort of reminds you of George Washington, then, they must be an ISTJ. Now, that's all well and good, but the problem is then you come across somebody who says, no, he wasn't an ISTJ, he was an ENTJ. And so now that throws off your orbit, right? You had a nice little reference point, and now you're thrown off into orbit because now somebody else is telling you that George Washington was an ENTJ or whatever, right? And so now you're faced with, okay, do I just, dig in my heels and, keep George Washington being an ISTJ and just tell the other person that they're crazy? Or do I sort of take into account what they're saying and maybe sort of tinker the way that I think about it and maybe change my frame of reference? Okay. And so now he's gone off into a different orbit. He's no longer in your ISTJ orbit. He's in your ENTJ orbit. And so that takes everybody else that you thought was an ENTJ. And now you have to sort of second guess, okay, are these people ENTJs? Because they don't seem anything like George Washington. So maybe I've got ENTJ wrong, right? So it's you're constantly doing that, and trust me, I know. I've been doing this for so long, and then you'll be convinced. Like my thing over the weekend, like I was convinced, just like everybody else, that Elon Musk was an INTJ or maybe an ENTJ, until I was listening to him on a podcast. I was like, he doesn't seem like an intuitive at all. And so I watched somebody else's video. I'm like, yeah, he's totally an ISTJ. So sometimes changing your frame of reference is a good thing, right? I'm not trying to say you should find one frame of reference and stick with it and tell everybody else to go to hell. But it does make things complicated, no matter how long you've been doing it, right? Okay. So now we know it's just a big mess. And there's really no way to get everybody to focus on it. I mean, there's certainly people out there who, have a very, very strong opinion of their ability to type and, but they just change it into sort of a war of attrition. Like they just want to tell you, you're dumb, without giving you any sort of framework where they're like, okay, if you can show me that they do this, then I will accept that, I'm wrong about whatever I typed them. However, there is at least one framework out there that attempts to do that gets as close to that as I think is probably possible. And that's the, defensible typology approach at talking with famous people, where, we can all disagree with, whether or not somebody's, he types somebody as an INFJ, and you might think they're an ENFJ or an ISTJ or something like that. But the thing is like he's at least putting a framework out there, and I'll get into what the framework is, where it follows the fundamental rule of science or epistemology of basically saying, look, I've got a theory, I've got a hypothesis that, this person is a particular type, this person's an ISTJ, but if you can show me, that that they've got a polar function that is not the ISTJ's polar function, right? Then you can convince me that I'm wrong, right? So there's at least a framework. Now, the battle of the evidence of whether or not your evidence is, convincing enough is one thing, but at least there's a framework, right? At least he's putting himself out there and saying, any particular type is going to have a polar function. And if you can show me that this person, demonstrates, having this polar function, or even a better way of putting it is if you could show me this person is not polar in what they should be if they're an ISTJ. So in other words, if you're an ISTJ, you should be polar in FE, right? But if I can show a bunch of evidence and say, look, they're clearly not FE polar because they do X, Y, and Z, and here's all the evidence for it, then that just, at least at a very baseline, there, there is a model or a framework where you can convince the person that they're wrong. Now, they might not agree with the evidence that you're giving, right? That's all subjective, and I don't know if we'll ever get past that. But that's how it works in science all the time anyways, right? People will have these scientific theories that, like, the hippocampus does spatial memory, and only spatial memory. And then a bunch of people will come along and give them evidence that it's doing other types of memory, and they'll be like, oh, no, I don't believe that evidence. That evidence isn't good enough. It's not reliable. It's not replicatable, or whatever, right? They'll argue on the evidence, but that's fine. But at least they're playing by the same rules, right? Like, they're playing by the same framework, and they're not just sort of saying, well, I went to Harvard and I've been doing this for 25 years. And when I was at Harvard 25 years ago, they told me that the hippocampus is involved in memory. So what did you do? Right? And that's like half of the, MBTI community out there. And I'm not picking on anybody in particular. It's been like this for decades, trust me. But instead, at least in the scientific community, at least the good scientists, like, they understand what the framework is. They understand what the rules are, right? So going back to the defensible typology method, if everybody sort of agreed, like, okay, here are the rules, right? Like, you just have to focus in on whether the person's polar on a particular function or not. At least we've got a framework, right? And that gets us way closer than just people sort of pointing and saying, well, look, he's showing that he likes ideas, or he's showing that he likes fast cars, or he's showing that he's athletic, or he's showing that, he was grounded and, based off of sensing and stuff like that. But just sort of piling on without focusing on, okay, well, what is the core? What is the linchpin? What is the thing that definitively will tell you, whether they're one particular type or not? Okay. And that would be, the polar function, right? And so if you're going to be arguing about a particular type, whether somebody is a type or they're not a type, in my opinion, the best thing to do is to focus on the polar, right? Like, to be able to say, look, this person is an ENFP because they show that they're polar on introverted thinking, right? That's ENFP's polar. Yeah. So, and, here's all the evidence that, that they've got just issues with TI, right? And so you have to show some sort of evidence that they've got issues with TI. But showing that they've got FE or FI or extroverted intuition or introverted intuition doesn't tell us anything, because everybody's got that. It's the polar function that is the linchpin. It's the polar function that you have to focus on. Now, if I come to you and say, Dave Chappelle is an ESFP, and you think he's an ENFP, now, if we've got a framework that we can work in, I could point to all the evidence that shows that he is TI polar. Actually, that's a bad example, because they would both be TI polar. Let me think of a better example. If I think he's an ESFP and you think he's an ISFP, then it's, sort of the burden's on me to show that he's got some sort of polar introverted thinking, and the burden would be on you to show that no, he's not polar on introverted thinking. Here's also, here are all these examples of him using pretty heavy TI reliably. And then the burden would be on you, if you think he's an ISFP, to show that he's got, what would it be? Polar extroverted intuition, right? Sorry. It's been a long day. My brain's very slow right now. So whatever the, polar extrovert intuition, and, here are some examples of him sort of breaking down when having to use, extrovert intuition. And here's, and then the burden would be on me to say, no, here's also a bunch of examples that he's using polar or extroverted intuition. So you can't be polar on that. And then we're arguing about the data, right? We're arguing about the evidence, but we're not arguing about the fundamental framework, right? And then, we could publish all our papers or publish all of our YouTube videos trying to mount the evidence in our favor and mount the evidence against, the other person's claim, and that's fine, right? I mean, that's the fun part of it. But both of us just sort of picking a type and then trying to find all this stuff, for all the non-polar functions doesn't really help. I mean, and I hope this makes some sort of sense. Because, like really understanding the scientific method and falsifiability and all that, takes a little time to sort of, have it sort of sink in. Or at least sort of get intuitively. Okay. So, and then you're also not dealing with that sort of three body problem, right? Like you've got sort of a grounded area of focus, as opposed to just, floating around in different orbits, right? Where you think somebody's an ESFP, somebody else thinks that they're ENTP, and now you're in the ENTP orbit and you're trying to bring everybody who, is sort of an ENTP and maybe an ESFP, I don't know. And it's just, they're in one orbit and they're in another orbit and then they're in another orbit. And it's just chaotic and unruly, right? Because there's never, like, as far as I know, there's just no grounded figure that everybody can agree, to, this person is that, or that sort of put the stake in the ground. Now, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of people who disagree that everybody agrees on one type or not. I've just never seen it, but if they're out there, let me know. Okay. And so the other thing I was going to mention is that there's this hilarious video, and for whatever reason, I just wanted to link it below, and it just cracks me up. And it's been around for a while, and it really demonstrates, again, just sort of a problem with typology. I linked it below. Take a look at it, but it's hilarious where this guy is just sort of playing with one of those children's toy buckets where, there's holes of different shapes and there's blocks, and you're supposed to put the blocks of different shapes into the corresponding hole, right? Like the circle goes in the circle, the square goes in the square, the triangle goes in the triangle. But it turns out with these particular blocks, they all fit in the square hole. And so he's taking each block and he's just putting it, this one goes in the square hole, this one goes in the square hole, this one goes in the square hole. And then, of course, there's somebody watching that's like, getting visibly disturbed by this. And the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of people who will take, the various shapes and put them all in the square hole, right? Like all these shapes are INFJs, right? And they won't explain. And like, they pick up the shape and it clearly is supposed to go into a different hole, but they just keep putting it in the square hole. And any outside observer is like, well, they're clearly not a square. Why are you putting them in the square hole? But the reason that, he can put them in the square hole is because they all fit in one way or another in the square hole. And my point is that if you take any person, right, you can make them fit into the square hole. You can make them fit into an INFJ. You can make them fit into an ESFP. You especially somebody where, there's enough sort of data, evidence, enough videos out there on them. You can cherry pick the data and find, an argument for making them an INFP or making them an ISTJ, right? Where everybody else sees you picking up that block and it's like, that's clearly a square, or that's clearly a triangle. Why are you putting the triangle in the square hole? Well, see, it fits. See, it fits, right? And so by putting and this doesn't mean that, you're always going to put somebody in the INFJ hole, or you're always going to put somebody in the ESTJ hole or something like that. The point is that every single block you pick up can fit into the square hole. It can fit into one of those holes. Just like every person that you come across, you can find some sort of evidence to make them fit into your square hole, right? Again, if you want to make them into an INFJ, you can make them into an INFJ. Or if somebody, is out there saying, I'm an INFJ, and you think they're an ESTP, you can definitely find enough evidence to put them in the square hole and say that they're ESTP, even though everybody else sees you picking up, an INFJ block and putting it into the ESFP hole. You can't walk away saying, see, they're clearly an ESFP because I fit them into the ESFP square hole. I hope that makes sense. Watch the video. Maybe it'll resonate. So what do you do, right? I mean, and again, I think really the only reliable way is to use some sort of framework where somebody can convince you that you're wrong, right? So going back to the square hole guy, if all I had to, if I went to him and I was like, you're wrong about this shape, right? It's supposed to go in this other hole, right? This triangle is supposed to go in the triangle hole. Clearly, that's what they fit. And if he just says, nope, look, it goes in the square hole. You're wrong. Look, you can put it in the square hole. How do you convince that guy that he's wrong, right? How do you convince him that, he's doing it wrong? Because clearly everything fits in whatever hole he's trying to put them in. And so going back to my original point, you need to go to the person and say, okay, what can I tell you to convince you that you're wrong? What can I tell you to convince you that this triangle does not go into the square hole, right? And, and welcome to typology. That's sort of the fundamental problem we always deal with. That being said, I mean, there's some people who sort of intuitively, I think they're sort of more on the wavelength. They've got sort of a right brain sort of intuitive feel for what a type is, right? Like they see the block and it's clearly a triangle. But then somebody comes along and puts the triangle in the square hole, and then we're all confused, okay? So, okay, I hope that makes sense. It makes sense to me. It's one of these like total NI things. And the last point I wanted to make, right? So going back to the defensible typology, not only does it provide a framework where you can falsify somebody's hypothesis, right? Rather than just shoving them into the square hole. You could actually, there's actually a framework where I say somebody's an ISTJ, but there is a way to prove me wrong, right? By showing that they're not polar where they should be polar for an ISTJ. So they're not FE polar. And they could come up with a counterclaim and say, they're not an ISTJ, they're an ENFP. And here's all the evidence for them being polar on where ENFPs would be polar, introverted thinking, right? So there's an actual way to go back and forth, and then we're just debating about the evidence. But, that's fine. That's what scientists do. But in addition to that, there's predictive value in it. Where and again, harping back on my ISTJ buddy out there who wrote out the response to these polar questions, and they are exactly what you would predict under the defensible typology framework, right? Like the top two functions, no problem. Okay, great. But the point is when they get to the polar function, they clearly do not want to engage in that function. right? Based off of that response. Now, maybe they're gaming the system or whatever, but ISTJs would never do that. And so there's no way to know with 100% certainty, but it is so much farther, to the sort of level of certainty on that end of the spectrum than, me just looking at somebody and being like, yeah, they're an ISTJ, put them in the square hole. It's the predictive value, right? So any sort of good epistemological framework, and I'm sorry, I keep butchering that word, any good framework is going to have, predictive value and a way to make falsifiable claims, right? And if there's any other framework out there, that you think is just as good or better, let me know, because I'd love to see it. The MBTI, the actual inventory, comes somewhat close, but there's in terms of like predictability, but there's really no way to sort of falsify it, and that's why all the hard and fast psychology researchers, or psychologists or whatever you want to call them, dismiss it because it's, at its core, it's not very falsifiable, right? And I won't go into that, but there's plenty out there written on it. But it does have very good predictive value, I would say. If somebody comes out as an ESTJ on the inventory, they probably are an ESTJ. It's pretty reliable. It's pretty valid across, people's lifespan, as long as they're not gaming the system and trying to, be something that they're not. But it's just sort of fundamentally not falsifiable, and that's what people have a problem with. But if you can think of a way in which it's falsifiable, certainly let me know. I'm willing to listen. Okay, I think that's about it. I've gone on long enough. I'd be interested in your comments. Sorry for just sort of being all over the place. But okay, have a good night. Talk to you later. Bye.